The moment I walked into the Kardashian clinic, I thought I'd stepped into a dream, a world where fame, wealth, and beauty collided in perfect harmony. But the truth? The truth was far darker than anything I could have imagined. Beneath the polished surfaces and perfect smiles, something sinister was happening. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized. I wasn't just in a clinic, I was in a trap. The moment I walked into the Kardashian clinic, it felt like stepping into a dream laced with impossibly high expectations and a glittering world where everything was polished, perfected, and seemingly flawless. As I pushed through the glass doors, the cool, sterile air hit my face, mingling with the faint scent of lavender and antiseptic. The clinic was pristine, as if untouched by the outside world, and yet, somehow, it felt like a world unto itself. The walls were a stunning shade of white, and everything gleamed, from the sparkling marble floors beneath my feet to the glimmering steel of the cutting-edge medical equipment. Even the receptionist was an ethereal image of elegance, her smile so practiced it seemed like it could have been part of a beauty treatment. There were no signs of the usual chaos you'd expect from a busy clinic. Instead, the space exuded calm, tranquility, and a sense of divine control. I had heard the rumors. Everyone had, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality. This wasn't just a clinic. It was a sanctuary for the rich and famous, a temple to beauty and perfection. The Kardashians, as I'd come to learn, were not just celebrities. They were walking ideals, icons in their own right. And they didn't just represent beauty, they created it. And now, I was part of that process. When they offered me the position, I had almost pinched myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Working at the Kardashian clinic was every doctor's fantasy, or at least, it was mine. I had spent years studying, training, and climbing the medical ladder, and this was my reward. A chance to work with the elite, to be part of a world that most people could only dream about. At first, it all felt surreal. Treating celebrities wasn't like treating regular patients. It was an entirely different experience. Their faces were known across the globe, their every move scrutinized by the press. Here, I wasn't just a doctor. I was a part of their public image, a cog in the machine that maintained their polished, perfect personas. There was an odd kind of reverence in the air, one that made me feel both honored and slightly uncomfortable. This was a place where privacy didn't exist. Everything, every procedure, every touch, every glance was public. It was as if the very notion of personal had been erased, replaced by a carefully curated narrative. And I was the one helping to shape it. Kim Kardashian was the first celebrity I treated. I had seen her on TV, of course, watched her rise from a socialite to an international mogul, but nothing could have prepared me for the real-life version. She was exactly as you'd imagine, poised, immaculate, a perfect blend of grace and power. She didn't just walk into the room, she commanded it. Her skin was smooth, almost ethereal, her eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that comes from both experience and careful calculation. It was during her second visit that I noticed something strange. As I prepped for the procedure, I brushed my gloved hand across her arm, and for a brief moment, I thought I felt something unusual. Something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I dismissed it, telling myself it was probably just a trick of the light or some residual tension from the anxiety of my first big appointment. But deep down, I knew there was something there. The clinic was a well-oiled machine, and it was clear that every employee was trained to perfection. The staff moved with an eerie precision, performing their tasks with robotic efficiency. There was no chit-chat, no casual banter, no sense of familiarity or warmth between us. It felt almost like we were part of an experiment ourselves, each person functioning in a role that was as tightly controlled as the treatments we administered. We were professionals, yes, but we were also invisible, hidden behind the scenes. Nothing more than shadows in a world of celebrities and their carefully cultivated images. Still, as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the flawless beauty of the place or the high-profile clients. It was the underlying tension. No one spoke about anything personal. We all followed orders without question. There were whispers about procedures and techniques, but always in hushed tones, as if no one wanted to say anything that might tip the balance. The secrecy surrounding the clinic, its staff, and its patients was palpable. I soon realized that the clinic wasn't just about beauty. It was about something far more profound. It was about control. Beauty was only the surface. What lay beneath was far more complex, and that's what I hadn't expected. Every treatment wasn't simply about restoring youth or enhancing physical appearance. It was about perfection, and in the pursuit of that perfection, the clinic had perfected the art of manipulation, not just of the body, but of the very people who entered through its doors. What unsettled me even more was how everything was designed to maintain a persona. There were no accidents here, no mistakes. Every procedure was done with precision, timed down to the smallest fraction of a second, and even the patient's personal lives were monitored to ensure they stayed on track. The Kardashians, of course, were the crown jewels of the clinic, but even the most obscure reality TV stars or influencers who walked through those doors were treated like royalty. But then, as if to remind me that this was no ordinary clinic, I noticed something on Kim during one of her follow-up visits. A small, faint mark beneath her flawless skin. At first I thought it was a scar, maybe from a previous procedure. But as I leaned in closer, I realized it was something different, something more deliberate. There, under her skin, was a number, a faint barcode-like mark, etched into the flesh. It wasn't just a cosmetic flaw. It was something far deeper, something sinister. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. I had seen something that wasn't just a part of the treatment. This was different. This was something that could change everything. But how could I have known then that what I had stumbled upon was just the beginning of a terrifying truth? The days began to blur together as I settled into my new role at the Kardashian clinic. At first, it felt like I was living in a dream where beauty, luxury, and fame were the only currencies that mattered. But as the novelty wore off, a strange unease began to settle in, creeping up on me like a shadow in the corners of the clinic. Something wasn't right. Something was hidden beneath the sparkling surface of this world, and it was starting to feel impossible to ignore. The patients at the clinic were everything I had imagined. Dazzling, untouchable, larger than life. The air around them crackled with the intensity of their fame. Yet, the more I worked, the more I realized there was something unsettling about the way they were treated. These were not just medical procedures. These were meticulously crafted, precision-engineered rituals designed not only to perfect the outside, but to shape the very essence of their public personas. Every procedure, every treatment felt like part of a much larger, far-reaching agenda, and I was only beginning to understand its true scale. At first, it seemed like just another high-end medical facility, a place where cosmetic enhancements were the primary focus and the wealthiest of the wealthy came to preserve their beauty, to halt the inevitable march of time. The clinic was an assembly line for the rich, where the quest for eternal youth never ceased. But the more I paid attention, the more I started to question why so many of these treatments were shrouded in secrecy. There were locked doors and hidden files, employees who spoke in hushed tones, and medical protocols that seemed to go beyond the typical beauty treatments I was familiar with. Why were certain procedures never discussed? Why did everything feel so calculated, so precise? I tried to ignore my growing unease, telling myself that this was just part of the job. After all, I was here to do a job, administer treatments, assist in surgeries, and follow orders. But something about the clinic's operation felt off. There were no casual conversations between the staff, no downtime to relax or chat. Everyone moved like clockwork, carrying out their tasks with a robotic efficiency that didn't allow for the small moments of connection you'd expect in any other medical environment. It was as though we were all pieces in a grand, carefully orchestrated performance, and I was just one small part of it. One afternoon, as I sat in the staff break room, I overheard a conversation between two nurses that set off alarm bells in my head. They were talking in low voices, but their words pierced the silence, making me pause mid-sip of my coffee. One nurse mentioned something about a special procedure and how it was coming up soon. The other nurse quickly hushed her, glancing nervously around the room as if afraid someone might overhear. They fell silent, and the conversation abruptly shifted to something more mundane. But I couldn't shake the words from my mind. Special procedure. What was that? I wondered. What procedure was being referred to as special, and why was it so secretive? I didn't know, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to fit into the larger puzzle that I was starting to piece together. This wasn't just a clinic focused on beauty. It was a place where secrets were guarded like treasures, where every procedure seemed to have a hidden layer. A week later, I found my first clue. It wasn't much, just a casual mention in a patient's medical record, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The file I was reviewing belonged to one of the clinic's regular clients, someone I had seen on TV more times than I could count. The record was for a routine procedure, but at the bottom of the page was a reference to something called Project 23. It was an odd notation, one that didn't seem to fit with the rest of the information in the file. The rest of the document was filled with standard medical terms, treatment plans, and a long list of prescriptions. But Project 23 was different. It wasn't something I'd ever encountered before. There was no further explanation, no context, just a series of numbers and a cryptic project code. I stared at the screen for a long time, my mind racing. I had no idea what Project 23 was, but the fact that it was referenced in such a nonchalant manner, buried in the middle of a medical record, only deepened my suspicions. This wasn't just a beauty clinic. There was something more going on here, something hidden in plain sight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the file and the strange project code. What was it? Was it some kind of experimental procedure? A new treatment? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that whatever Project 23 was, it was not something that the patients or the public were meant to know. The secrecy surrounding it felt deliberate, as if the clinic was deliberately keeping it under wraps. I had to know more. The next day, I made a decision. I would dig deeper. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I couldn't let this go. I started by combing through the clinic's medical files, looking for any mention of Project 23 or anything related to it. It wasn't easy. Most of the files were locked, encrypted, or buried under layers of bureaucracy, but I was determined. The more I searched, the more I began to realize that I was stepping into a web of secrecy that extended far beyond the walls of the clinic. I found more references to Project 23 over the next few days. Small snippets buried within the medical records of various high-profile clients. Some of the files were heavily redacted, but the pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't just a cosmetic procedure. It was part of something much bigger, something that involved altering the very nature of the patients. The more I dug, the clearer it became that the clinic wasn't just about maintaining beauty. It was about perfecting it, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But I wasn't ready for what I would find next. One evening, as I sifted through another patient's record, I came across something that sent a chill down my spine. A single line in the file read, "Patient number 42, Project 23, DNA modification successful." The words were simple, but the implications were terrifying. DNA modification. This wasn't about beauty treatments. This was about something much darker. Something that could alter the course of human biology itself. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the truth was far worse than anything I could have imagined. The clinic wasn't just about perfection. It was about control. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized that I was in way over my head. The clinic had always felt like a place of perfection, polished, immaculate, a well-oiled machine designed to maintain an image. But with each passing day, I began to see cracks in that facade. And the further I dug into the hidden files, the more I realized that the clinic's true purpose was far darker than I had ever imagined. It had been nearly a week since I first stumbled across the cryptic reference to Project 23 in one of the patient files. At first, I had thought it might be a fluke, some odd code or internal project that had nothing to do with the procedures we were carrying out. But as the days passed, my curiosity grew, and I began to uncover more references to it. Each mention was carefully buried within the stacks of paperwork that flooded the clinic's database. It was as though the clinic had made a concerted effort to bury it deep, out of sight, out of mind. But I wasn't ready to let go. The more I uncovered, the more obsessed I became. Project 23 wasn't just some administrative code or internal system. It was part of something much bigger, something that felt like it was meant to change the course of history. My head buzzed with the possibilities. Could it be a new form of treatment? Some radical new procedure to guarantee eternal youth and beauty? The more I thought about it, the more I began to fear what the truth might be. Late one night, after the clinic had emptied out for the evening, I found myself sitting at my desk, the only light in the room coming from the dim glow of my computer screen. I had come to a decision. I had to learn everything I could about Project 23. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I might find, but I knew I couldn't back out now. This was bigger than just one clinic. This could be something that could change the world, and I couldn't just walk away from it. With the clinic's internal network, it was relatively easy to gain access to restricted files, though it took some creative thinking and a little extra work. The files that were most heavily protected were often the ones that caught my attention. And Project 23 was definitely one of those files. I cracked the code, gaining access to the hidden records, and what I found inside made my stomach drop. The first thing I noticed was a list of patients under the project name. They weren't just random celebrities or high-profile clients, but a select group of individuals who had been undergoing procedures that seemed far beyond the scope of simple cosmetic treatments. The names listed were familiar. People I had treated, people whose faces were plastered on billboards and magazines. But there was something about this list that unsettled me. It wasn't just a list of procedures. It was a detailed record of genetic modifications. Modifications that seemed to be focused on altering the very makeup of the human body. Project 23 wasn't about beauty. It was about perfection. More specifically, it was about creating a perfect human being, one that could defy the normal limits of age, decay, and time. I read through the pages in disbelief as I learned more about the procedures. Genetic material was being altered on a cellular level to slow the aging process, to stop it completely in some cases. And it wasn't just the skin, the face, or the body. The clinic was manipulating the very building blocks of life itself. The more I read, the more I realized how deep this went. This wasn't just about making people look youthful. It was about changing their DNA, their very essence, to create something that could live forever. It was about immortality. The patients involved were not just celebrities. They were test subjects in a world-changing experiment, and they had no idea what was really happening to them. I felt sick as I scrolled through the reports. These were not routine procedures. They weren't about lifting a sagging jawline or tightening the skin around the eyes. No, these were genetic manipulations, aimed at stopping the aging process altogether. Some of the patients had undergone multiple procedures, their bodies modified in ways I couldn't even comprehend. I felt as though I was reading a scientific paper on a new species of human, one that was being meticulously cultivated in the very place I worked. I couldn't tear myself away from the screen. The more I read, the more horrified I became. The clinic, it seemed, had evolved into something far beyond a simple cosmetic surgery center. This was a laboratory, an experiment in the most extreme form. And the celebrities, they were pawns in a game I didn't even understand. But what troubled me the most was the lack of transparency. The patients weren't aware of what was truly happening to them. They had no idea that their genes were being altered, their very biology being rewritten in ways that could have profound consequences for the rest of humanity. They trusted the clinic to improve their beauty, to make them younger and more vibrant, but they were being used as test subjects in an experiment that could have disastrous consequences. As I read through more reports, I came across something that nearly made me drop the file. A note from one of the head researchers, buried deep within the project documentation, mentioned the term permanent modification. According to the note, the procedure was in its final phase, and it was only a matter of time before the patients would be fully transformed. It was clear from the note that the goal wasn't just to preserve beauty. The goal was to create an immortal human being, one that would never grow old, never succumb to the ravages of time. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. This was madness. What had I become a part of? The clinic was no longer a place of beauty. It was a breeding ground for something far darker, and I had stumbled upon the secret, the hidden truth that no one was supposed to know. But there was more. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered about the methods behind the project. It wasn't just about preserving youth or enhancing beauty. It was about rewriting the very essence of what it meant to be human. DNA modifications were being performed to not just halt aging, but to alter the genetic code in ways that could have catastrophic consequences. They were tampering with life itself, and I was standing on the edge of it, watching it unfold. I closed the file, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. I had to leave before I became part of this madness. But even as I stood up, I knew it was already too late. The more I uncovered, the more entangled I became in the web of secrecy and control. And once you're in that web, there's no way out. The more I uncovered about Project 23, the more I realized that I was no longer just dealing with a cosmetic clinic. It was far beyond anything I had ever imagined. What had started as a place where the rich and famous came to maintain their beauty had transformed into something far darker, more insidious, and undeniably dangerous. I had uncovered the truth behind the clinic's operations, but the deeper I dug, the more I questioned what I had gotten myself into. At first, it seemed almost plausible that the clinic was just pushing the boundaries of beauty and anti-aging. After all, the Kardashians and other celebrities had made careers out of their looks, and their very existence was a brand built on perfection. But what I had discovered wasn't just about beauty. It was about something far more profound, something terrifying. The clinic wasn't just altering skin tones or lifting sagging jaws. No, it was manipulating the very structure of life itself. Genetic modifications, DNA enhancements. These weren't just simple procedures. They were attempts to reshape humanity, to extend life beyond its natural limits, to create immortality. I began to understand that the clinic had become an experimental laboratory, a place where beauty was no longer the goal. It was simply the surface. The real mission was far more sinister. The goal was control. They weren't just making people look younger, they were making them live forever. The ultimate vanity project, no doubt. But there was a darkness lurking beneath the flawless surface. Something so much deeper than I could have anticipated. I started to see the clinic's true purpose as I spent more time in the hidden files. The treatments weren't just cosmetic. They were designed to stop the aging process itself, to halt the march of time and preserve perfection. The clients weren't just getting youthful skin. They were being altered at a cellular level. These weren't the typical procedures I was used to, where a facelift here or a wrinkle-free forehead there would ensure longevity in the public eye. No, this was something more invasive, more permanent. They were undergoing genetic alterations, modifications to their very DNA, to ensure that they wouldn't age, that they would stay frozen in time. What started as a subtle shift in my perspective became an overwhelming flood of realization. The more I learned, the more I understood that this was a full-blown genetic experiment, a desperate attempt to control the most basic element of human life, time. It wasn't just about beauty anymore. It was about rewriting biology, defying the laws of nature, and making sure that beauty, wealth, and power would never fade. I had seen the reports of successful treatments, patients who had undergone DNA manipulation and emerged with bodies that seemed to stop aging altogether. Their faces remained youthful, their skin perfect, their bodies untouched by the natural decay that afflicts all humans. But there was a problem, and it was something that no one had talked about. The changes weren't all positive. Some patients had undergone the treatments with impressive results, but others weren't so fortunate. There were signs of breakdown. The files detailed unexpected complications, accelerated cell degeneration in certain organs, immune system failures, even instances of complete neurological shutdown. But the most disturbing part? No one spoke about these failures openly. They were buried. They were hidden in the footnotes of medical records, glossed over as anomalies, glitches in an otherwise flawless system. This wasn't just a beauty clinic. It was a breeding ground for an experiment gone wrong. The patients, these beautiful, untouchable icons of the world, were no longer just celebrities. They were human guinea pigs, subjects in an experiment to create a new kind of human being. Ageless, immortal, and perfect. But at what cost? As I pieced together the files, I began to understand the broader implications of what I had uncovered. The clinic wasn't just treating these celebrities to maintain their public image. It was turning them into something else, something beyond human. They weren't simply getting cosmetic enhancements. They were being altered at a genetic level, their biology forever changed in the name of perfection. This was no longer about vanity. It was about something much bigger, much more dangerous. The deeper I dug, the more I started to feel like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape from. I wasn't just working in a clinic anymore. I was working in a factory for immortality. I couldn't ignore the implications of what I had found. The idea of creating immortal humans, altering their genetic makeup to stop aging, was as reckless as it was dangerous. There were too many unknowns, too many risks. The idea of playing God with human lives was terrifying. Yet that was exactly what was happening behind the gleaming walls of the Kardashian clinic. What frightened me the most wasn't just the science behind it, it was the secrecy. No one knew the full extent of what was going on. The patients didn't know. The public didn't know. And the worst part, no one was questioning it. The patients, these larger-than-life celebrities, trusted the clinic with their very lives without ever truly understanding what was being done to them. As I thought about it, I realized that this wasn't just about the celebrities. It was about control, power, and a twisted form of immortality that had gone unchecked. If this experiment succeeded, the clinic wouldn't just be creating ageless beauty, it would be creating a new form of humanity. A humanity that had no age, no end, no expiration date. But at what cost? The files spoke of failures, genetic breakdowns, organ failure, cognitive issues. This wasn't perfection. This was a dangerous game with human lives, and I was starting to realize that I had become part of it. I could feel the weight of what I had uncovered pressing down on me. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand by and watch as lives were ruined, as people were turned into immortal shells of themselves. I had to expose it. But how? And at what cost? But I wasn't the only one who knew the truth. The deeper I went, the more I realized that the clinic's grip on power went far beyond its patients. It was pulling strings everywhere. Secrets were kept not just from the public, but from the very people who worked there. And now, I have become entangled in it. There was no turning back. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the Kardashian clinic was not just a business. It wasn't simply a high-end beauty center catering to the world's elite. No, it was a well-oiled machine, a web of power and secrecy that controlled every aspect of its patients' lives. The clinic didn't just offer services. It shaped identities, created public personas, and maintained absolute control over every individual who passed through its doors. At first, I had been enamored by the surface, the luxury, the fame, the flawless beauty that seemed to define the place. But as time went on, the clinic began to feel more like a prison, a controlled environment where every movement was watched, every decision was calculated, and every word spoken carried weight. It wasn't just about beauty anymore. It was about control. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized just how tightly the clinic held the strings of its patients' lives. I had always suspected that the Kardashian family, along with the other celebrities who frequented the clinic, had more influence and power than the average person could comprehend. What I hadn't anticipated was the level of control the clinic exercised over them, not just physically, but psychologically. These weren't just procedures. They were psychological manipulations, part of a larger campaign to create and maintain perfect images for their clients. The first clue came when I noticed how the clinic staff interacted with the patients. There was an unnatural precision in everything we did. The doctors, the nurses, the assistants, everyone seemed to move in sync, as though we were all part of a performance. There was no room for error, no room for personal connection. Our role wasn't just to treat the patients. It was to uphold the perfect image that had been carefully crafted for them. I began to pay closer attention to the way the patients were treated. Each celebrity had a carefully curated routine, a rigid schedule of treatments, checkups, and procedures. Every aspect of their appearance was monitored, every flaw corrected, every imperfection erased. It wasn't just about staying youthful. It was about maintaining an unblemished public image. Their lives, in essence, were controlled by the clinic. Every decision, from what they wore, to what they said, to how they looked, was part of an overarching narrative that the clinic had helped to shape. But it wasn't just the patients who were controlled. The staff, too, were manipulated in subtle ways. We were told what to do, when to do it, and how to act, but we were never given the full picture. There was always something withheld, something we weren't meant to know. The clinic's higher-ups operated from the shadows, rarely seen but always present. They were the puppeteers, pulling the strings and ensuring that everything, every patient, every procedure, every moment was in line with their agenda. The more I observed, the more I began to feel like I was a part of something sinister, something that went beyond beauty. The clinic wasn't just shaping people's appearances, it was shaping their entire lives. The patients were being redefined, not just physically, but in terms of their very identities. Their worth wasn't defined by who they were or what they had achieved. It was defined by how they looked, by how perfectly they fit into the image that had been created for them. They were no longer just people. They were products. The control the clinic exerted was psychological as much as it was physical. The patients, especially those most famous, had been conditioned to see their worth through the lens of perfection. The clinic fed into their insecurities, playing on their deepest fears about aging, about losing relevance. The more I watched, the more it became clear. The clinic wasn't just selling beauty, it was selling immortality. Not in the physical sense, but in the sense of creating an eternal, unchanging image. And in that image, there was no room for flaws, no room for imperfection. I started to see the consequences of this psychological manipulation. There were patients who seemed almost robotic in their devotion to the clinic's protocol, following the prescribed routine of treatments with little question. They were so entrenched in the narrative the clinic had crafted for them that they couldn't imagine life outside of it. And then there were others who began to crack under the pressure. The ones who had been shaped by the clinic's narrative, only to realize that they were losing themselves in the process. There were whispers among the staff about the clinic's failures, patients who had resisted the treatments, who had tried to break free from the rigid control that the clinic had imposed on them. Some of them had left, unable to withstand the pressure of constant perfection. But others hadn't fared as well. The reports, hidden away in the depths of the clinic's records, were filled with stories of breakdowns, psychological, emotional, and even physical. Some of these patients had been so deeply altered by the clinic's manipulations that they had become shadows of their former selves. I began to feel trapped in this system. I wasn't just observing the transformation of the patients. I was becoming part of it. The more I learned, the more I realized that I had unwittingly become entangled in the clinic's web of control. The line between observer and participant had blurred, and now I was part of the system I had once been so in awe of. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the power the clinic held over its patients wasn't just about beauty. It was about control in its purest form. The clinic didn't just want to maintain its patients' looks. It wanted to maintain their loyalty, their dependence. The clinic wasn't just creating beautiful people, it was creating beautiful, loyal subjects who would forever be indebted to the system that had reshaped their lives. I had seen the truth, and now there was no going back. The clinic's power didn't just lie in its ability to maintain beauty, it lay in its ability to control its patients, to redefine them, to turn them into something else entirely. And the worst part? The patients had no idea how deeply they were being manipulated. As I sat in the clinic's sterile break room, my mind raced. I had uncovered the truth, but now I had to decide what to do with it. I couldn't walk away. I couldn't stay silent. The clinic had to be exposed, but how could I possibly reveal the extent of its control without destroying everything and everyone inside? By the time I realized the full scope of what the Kardashian clinic was truly doing, the line between beauty and immortality had completely blurred. What I thought were simple procedures to enhance youth and preserve beauty were, in fact, part of a much more sinister agenda. The clinic had long moved beyond merely perfecting appearances. It was attempting to rewrite the very essence of life. Project 23, a secretive experiment that I had first stumbled upon, was not just about halting aging or perfecting beauty. It was about creating a new breed of humans, genetically modified to live forever, immune to the ravages of time. But immortality came with a price, and the more I learned, the more I realized that the cost was much higher than anyone, especially the patients, could have imagined. It wasn't just the Kardashians who were part of this experiment. The clinic's elite clients were being subjected to radical genetic treatments, modifications designed to slow down and eventually stop the aging process altogether. These procedures were far from cosmetic. They were altering DNA, tampering with the very building blocks of life. And it wasn't only about maintaining beauty. It was about creating an ageless existence, a frozen ideal of perfection. But as I watched, the patients who underwent the most invasive treatments began to change in ways that couldn't be ignored. Their skin remained youthful, but their eyes grew vacant, their movements stiff, almost mechanical. They had become the physical embodiment of perfection, but it was a perfection that felt devoid of life, a chilling reminder that immortality might come with a loss of humanity. The more I observed, the more I saw the consequences of this twisted pursuit of eternal life. Some patients broke under the psychological pressure of constantly being redefined, reshaped, and remade. Others began to experience physical breakdowns, organs failing, immune systems collapsing, cognitive impairment setting in. The clinic, it seemed, was playing a dangerous game with human biology, and it wasn't always working out as planned. But this was kept hidden, swept under the rug. There was no room for failure in a place where beauty and perfection were sold as commodities. The clinic's facade of luxury and perfection had cracked, revealing the true cost of their experiments: the complete manipulation of the human form, the mind, and the spirit. As I dug deeper, it became impossible to ignore the dangers of what was happening behind the clinic's pristine walls. The promise of eternal youth was a lie, a hollow facade that masked the real consequences of tampering with nature. These celebrities, the faces of a culture obsessed with perfection, were becoming something far more monstrous than anyone had ever imagined. They were not the ageless icons they appeared to be. They were broken, both physically and psychologically. Yet despite the mounting evidence of failure, the clinic continued its experiments, pushing forward with Project 23, determined to perfect the formula for immortality. But as I gathered the courage to expose the truth, I realized that my own safety was on the line. I had seen too much, and now I was a liability. The clinic's power wasn't just in its ability to create beauty. It was in its ability to silence anyone who dared to question its methods. And now, the clinic wasn't just a place of transformation. It was a fortress built on secrets and lies. And I was stuck in the middle, knowing that the world needed to know the truth before it was too late. Final payoff. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of beauty and perfection, and I had uncovered it. But as I prepared to expose the clinic's dark secret, the weight of the consequences crushed me. The clinic's reach was too vast, its power too great. They wouldn't let me walk away. The lives I had uncovered, altered forever, were the cost of playing God. Now, as I stood on the precipice, ready to take the final step, I realized something chilling. By exposing their secrets, I was sealing my own fate. There would be no turning back.